have prayed about this, not once, not casually. You have prayed about this the way people pray when they actually mean it, on your knees, in the dark, with real words and real feeling and real desperation behind them. You have asked, you have believed, you have waited, and the thing you prayed about is still exactly where it was when you started. And somewhere in the waiting, a question has started forming that you can barely bring yourself to think clearly, let alone say out loud. Is anyone actually listening? That question doesn't mean your faith is gone. It might mean it's the most honest it has ever been. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from unanswered prayer. It's different from regular tiredness. It's different from disappointment. It's the exhaustion of sustained hope, of continuing to believe something will change while the evidence keeps suggesting it won't, of showing up to the same conversation, with the same request, and leaving with the same silence. And what makes it harder is that nobody really talks about it honestly. The language around prayer in most faith communities is almost entirely the language of breakthrough, of testimony, of the moment God came through, and those stories are real. But they create an invisible standard that the person sitting in the long middle of unanswered prayer quietly measures themselves against. And the measuring is painful, because the implicit message underneath all those breakthrough stories is that prayer works, which means if yours isn't working, the variable must be you, your faith, your consistency, your sin, your surrender, something you're doing wrong or not doing enough of. And that conclusion, quiet, persistent, rarely examined, is where something starts to go wrong. Not just emotionally, psychologically. Here's what happens inside a person when they pray repeatedly without seeing results. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. It is constantly, automatically, tracking the relationship between your actions and their outcomes. When an action consistently produces a result, your brain reinforces it. When an action consistently produces nothing, your brain begins to flag it, to reduce the emotional investment in it, to protect you from the pain of continued expectation. This is called learned helplessness, and it is one of the most well-documented psychological phenomena that exists. It was first observed in studies where subjects were exposed to outcomes they couldn't control, and what researchers found was striking. After enough experiences of acting and seeing no corresponding change, people stopped acting. Even when the situation changed and action would have worked, they didn't try. The pattern had been learned too deeply. The brain had concluded, not through conscious decision, but through accumulated experience, that effort and outcome were not connected, and it protected itself accordingly. When prayer goes unanswered long enough, something similar begins to happen spiritually. You don't stop praying all at once. It's more gradual than that. The words start feeling hollow. The posture of prayer becomes mechanical. You go through the motions because stopping feels like giving up, but the interior aliveness that used to accompany it has quietly drained away. And then you feel guilty about the hollowness, which makes the prayer feel even less real, which makes the silence feel even louder. But here's the part nobody is saying clearly enough, and this matters. The hollowness is not evidence that your faith has failed. It is evidence that you are a human being with a nervous system that responds to repeated experiences of unmet expectation the way every human nervous system does. With protection, with withdrawal, with the dampening of hope as a survival mechanism. This is not spiritual failure wearing a psychological name. This is what sustained hope costs a person. And the cost is real, and it deserves to be named as such. But here's where it gets more complicated, because learned helplessness is not the only thing happening when prayer seems to go unanswered. There's something else running underneath it, something more interior, more personal, more specific to you. Most people who have been praying a long time for the same thing have, somewhere in the process, quietly made a decision about what an answer has to look like. Not consciously, not deliberately, But the longer you pray for something specific, the more detailed the expected answer becomes inside you. You're praying for healing, but you've imagined what healed looks like. You're praying for restoration, but you've imagined who makes the first move and how. You're praying for direction, but you've imagined which door opens and when. And that image, that internal picture of what the answer looks like, has slowly become the definition of whether God has answered or not. And here's the painful truth hiding inside that. Some prayers have been answered, in forms that didn't match the picture, in ways that required something of you first, in directions you weren't looking, and they passed by unrecognized. Not because God was absent, but because the answer didn't look like the answer was supposed to look. This is not a rebuke. This is not you being told you missed your blessing. This is simply an honest observation about how human expectation works. The more specific and emotionally invested the picture becomes, the harder it is to see anything that doesn't match it as an answer at all. And now the nuance, because this is not the same for everyone. And it's important to say that. Some people have been praying for things that are genuinely, heartbreakingly not answered. Not because they had the wrong picture, not because of learned helplessness, not because of any internal dynamic, but because the answer has not come. The person didn't heal. The marriage ended. The child didn't return. The door didn't open. And to sit across from that kind of unanswered prayer and offer psychological explanations would be a cruelty. For those situations, the ones where the thing simply did not happen, there is no reframe that makes it clean. There is only the long, honest, unglamorous work of continuing to exist in relationship with a God whose timing and method and definition of redemption does not always match yours. That is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is an honest one, and honesty is the only thing that actually holds in those places. What Scripture does with unanswered prayer is something that deserves to be looked at slowly, because the biblical record is far less tidy than most teaching makes it sound. Paul prayed 3 times for his thorn to be removed. It wasn't. The answer he received was not removal. It was sufficiency in the presence of the thing. Hannah prayed for years before Samuel came. The Psalms are full of prayers that end without resolution. That close, not in breakthrough, but in the decision to keep trusting despite the continuing silence. And Jesus in Gethsemane prayed for the cup to pass. It didn't. The biblical model of prayer is not a model in which asking reliably produces the specific thing asked for. It is a model in which the asking keeps the relationship open, in which showing up to the conversation, even with desperation, even with confusion, even with the trembling edge of doubt, is itself the point, not as a mechanism for getting what you want, but as the honest, continued orientation of a human being toward the God they believe is there. The disciples asked Jesus to teach them to pray, and what he gave them was not a formula for getting answers. It was a posture, a way of being in relation. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Give us what we need today. The prayer is not primarily transactional, it is relational, and the relationship is the answer to a question the request was never actually asking. So here is the reframe. Not a solution, not a theological explanation that makes the waiting painless, just a different place to stand inside it. The prayers that feel unanswered are not evidence that God is absent, or that your faith is insufficient, or that you are doing something wrong. They are evidence that you are a person who has not given up, who keeps showing up to a conversation that costs you something, who is honest enough to bring the real thing, the desperation, the confusion, the barely holding on, instead of the polished version. That kind of prayer is not weak. It is among the most courageous things a person can do. And maybe the question worth sitting with is not why God hasn't answered. Maybe it's this. What has the waiting done inside you? Who have you become in the long middle of this? What has sustained hope, even when it hurt, formed in you that comfort never could have. Not because the pain was good, not because the silence was the plan, but because in the waiting, something real was happening. Something that doesn't show up in breakthrough testimonies. Something quieter and slower and more permanent than a single answered prayer. You are still here, still praying, still oriented towards something you cannot see or feel or prove. That is not nothing. That is not failure wearing the clothes of faith. That might be exactly what faith looks like from the inside.